Welcome to the Arizona Author Series. This event was recorded on April 18, 2024. The Arizona Author Series is supported by the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records, a division of the Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Robert H. Webb about his book, Requiem for the Santa Cruz, An Environmental History of an Arizona River, co-authored by Julio L. Bentecourt, R. Ray Johnson, and Raymond M. Turner. Dr. Robert H. Webb has worked on long-term changes in natural ecosystems of the southwestern United States since 1976. He has degrees in engineering, a BS from the University of Redlands, environmental earth sciences, an MS from Stanford University, and geosciences, a PhD from the University of Arizona. Since 1985, he was a research hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Tucson, where he retired from in 2013, and an adjunct faculty member of the School of Natural Resources and the Department of Hydrology and Water Resources at the University of Arizona. Webb has authored or edited 15 books and about 250 publications, as well as given around 400 presentations in his 45-year career. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Webb and glad you can join us.
Okay, well, thank you for listening to this. The other morning, a few days ago, I opened the Arizona Daily Star, which I'm one of the few people that still reads a newspaper. I noticed on the front page that there was an article that said that the Santa Cruz River was the number 4 most endangered river in the United States. And the quote got my attention. It's from American Rivers, called the Santa Cruz a symbol of resilience and restoration that faces renewed threats from climate change and water scarcity. And again, that was a few days ago. And I went, huh? On earth was this? And maybe American Rivers just a little late to the party, because we published a book in 2013 about the Santa Cruz called Requiem for the Santa Cruz. And as she mentioned, there were 5 authors actually, including the foreword. I'm going to just go through them. But first, let's look at some words. Requiem for the Santa Cruz River. Our title of our book was referring to a memorial song of death. And I'll explain why that is in just a minute. But American Rivers was kind of implying maybe it should have been resurrection of the Santa Cruz River, implying revival from death. So let's just take a look at that as the themes of this talk today. First, the authors. Here they are in list. Ray Turner, 62 years professional experience. Roy Johnson, another 62 years professional experience as an ornithologist. Julio Bentecourt, a paleoclimatologist and ecologist, 39 years professional experience. At the time of this, I had 45 years of professional experience. We had a combined 260 years of professional experience, and I'm sad to say that Ray Turner and Bunny Fontana are now dead. I want to try to point out through the course of this talk what the various people contributed here, and it's going to be a little difficult because it's all intertwined. So here's the central question. What do we want from our arid region rivers? Well, we want water for development. That should be pretty obvious. We want flood control. We want to be able to build next to these rivers. And we expect ecosystems for biodiversity. And this is a photograph of the San Pedro, not the Santa Cruz, by the way. So all 3 of those things and how they work in, can we have our cake and eat it too with all 3 of these things? I'm very skeptical about that, but boy, we sure want to. So let's look at it. When it comes down to our arid region rivers, we're left with 3 basic inputs to how to manage them. 1, science. 1 is advocacy. And 1 is engineering. But overriding all of that is politics. And politics just keeps interfering all the way around in all of this. But on the Santa Cruz in particular, as I'll show here, the 3 intersect on this river in a big way, showing how complicated it is, how we manage our arid region rivers. Myths and reality, in this post-truth era, as it's so called, maybe it's what you want to choose to believe as opposed to what we actually know that's important. So people have chosen to believe that the Santa Cruz was perennial its entire length. That's not true. Before 1878, the river had alternating perennial and ephemeral reaches that were related to high groundwater discharge points, and riparian vegetation was established at those points. The river was ephemeral at various reaches through the Tucson Basin, from Continental to Pima Mine Road, for example, and downstream from Marana to the Gila River. So it wasn't totally a perennial river, no matter what anybody says. The other one is it flowed at the surface throughout the Tucson Basin. No, it's not true. The head cuts were present and indicating a discontinuous arroyo, and it was channelized with alternating perennial ephemeral flow. In geomorphology parlance, this was a classic discontinuous ephemeral stream. It could have been written up in a textbook. One of the other myths was that the Santa Cruz had beaver, large fish, and turtles in the Tucson Basin. Well, beavers have only been documented, and this is in all of our recorded history, at the border near Nogales and upstream into the San Rafael Valley in Santa Cruz County, not in the Tucson Basin or Pima County. Some water-dependent turtles were in the Great Mesquite Forest, and we'll get to that. Fish were also there, and generally small. Highly localized reaches, including the Gila top minnow and the longfin dace. And I think we'll be getting back to those as well. What we did in an environmental history was assemble all kinds of evidence, ranging from anecdotal evidence of written descriptions from various people who passed through, to photographs that showed the river at various times, and then to measurements that have been made at various times as well. Putting these pieces together is a difficult thing, and requires some extrapolation and interpolation, and that's what we've tried to do with all those years of experience that we have. So here's a timeline of historical observations from 1700 to the present. So first off, 1700, Father Kino arrived in the Tucson Basin, and there was a written record of his observations on the place. The Mormon Battalion passed through on their way to California, 1846. They wrote descriptions. Rainfall records began in 1869, I believe. First ornithologists visited the Tucson Basin right around 1875. First photographs were taken in the late 1870s. Then newspaper accounts documented floods with the Arizona Daily Star and the Arizona Citizen before 1900. Stream flow gauging began on the Santa Cruz in 1914, and then from 1900 to the present, we have a whole lot of ornithologists visiting Tucson to see the Great Mesquite Forest. We'll get to that. We know from photographs and a lot of records that the arroyo widening occurred in the 19-teens. Turbine pumps were introduced into the groundwater aquifer around 1921. Aerial photographs began in 1936. And then we have the mid-century drought, very well documented in a lot of places. And then satellites came in 1964, adding another layer of data. Groundwater use peaked as a result of the Arizona groundwater law that was established in 1980. Soil cement was installed along the Santa Cruz River starting in 1982. Then the 1983 flood occurred, and the 1993 flood occurred, all well documented in Tucson history. So downcutting of the arroyo is the central first part of this story. And this is Julio Betancourt's dissertation. Before 1880, again, the Santa Cruz had a series of alternating perennial and ephemeral reaches. There was a perennial reach down near Martinez Hill, near Mission Santa Fe. There was another perennial reach that was in the vicinity of Valencia Road down to what's probably present-day Silver Lake Road. And then, I'm sorry, not Silver Lake, but down to maybe Irvington. And then another perennial reach right around a mountain, going from about what's now 22nd Street down to just above Congress Street. And then it's dry from there on down. So it was discontinuous with high groundwater levels. And we know about this really large cienega south of Martinez Hill, which we named the Great Mesquite Forest, and how that changed through time. Again, Julio Betancourt's dissertation, this is really a documentation of a lot of the changes that occurred along the river, as well as things that happened in terms of people building ditches and making head cuts, trying to stabilize head cuts. So one of the key ones here is the Sam Hughes Intercept Ditch, which was built in 1889, just downstream of St. Mary's Road. That's the one that's kind of key to all of this. Santa Cruz River began downcutting and coalescing in the 1880s, and it was associated with large and or frequent floods on the river, mostly frequent floods, as it turns out. That Sam Hughes Ditch down near St. Mary's Road was actually designed to erode during floods because he wanted to create an irrigation canal to his fields that were off to the west. At an unknown time, but before 1900, the arroyo became continuously incised through the Tucson Basin. So arroyo cutting pretty much was localized on a few decades of history. Here's a few photographs that show that. This is the Santa Cruz River just upstream of A Mountain, showing how wide it is at this particular time with definite arroyo banks right around, I think it's 1882. This is a cartoon that I made that kind of shows what's going on from in 1862 or before 1862. There was a high groundwater level and, an arroyo with very low banks and growing mostly alkali saccatone grasses. And there was high groundwater conditions, marshy conditions in there. Then there was an arroyo downcut that happened, most of it 1889 to 1900, but continuing down into 1914, getting deeper. What happened there was that you cut into that alluvial aquifer and drained it, which allows trees to grow. And we'll get back to that point because that's a central part of this discussion. Then with widening, 1914 to 1930, just widened out the channel through a series of floods, and it took away a lot of the riparian vegetation, leaving some, but not a lot in the Tucson Basin. So the cause of arroyo downcutting is something that I worked on for my dissertation nearly 40 years ago now, as it turns out. There are 4 basic causes that have been proposed for arroyo downcutting. One is the introduction of livestock into the watershed, floodplain disturbance, the development of canals and other infrastructure on the floodplains. Groundwater declines due to drought was a paper actually published in the journal Science right around 1980 or so, 1979. And then finally, climatic variability, or something that I think we're all been oversaturated with lately. So we'll talk about all of those now. But the key thing that's important here and that people forget is it takes water to transport sediment. And if you're going to downcut an arroyo, you're going to transport sediment. So where is the water coming from? So with livestock grazing, the hypothesis is that overgrazing destroyed rangeland vegetation, causing increased watershed and erosion, leading to arroyo downcutting. Well, there's a lot of holes in that hypothesis. First one is, how does that explain the fact that there were paleo arroyos, or arroyos that have been documented up to 1,000 to 4,000 years ago on the Santa Cruz River? There weren't any livestock present then. Second one is that increased runoff and sediment yield should lead to sediment inundation. In other words, the channel should have filled up, not downcut. That's one that nobody has been able to actually offer any kind of an explanation for. And the other one is that livestock got on the watershed in 1700 with Father Tino. He came in with herds of cows and horses. And there were large numbers in the 1860s, but no arroyo down cutting at those times. So it was definitely not a one-to-one relation there. There's no question that livestock grazing would have set up some bad things that could have increased the erosion that occurred, but it's certainly not the only cause of that erosion. And here's the data that we've got, the only data we've got from census numbers. There's the human population of Tucson and Pima County. You can see that that's really after 1940s when that started to take off. So the arroyo downcutting was in the 1890s to 1900 period. Livestock was actually at its lowest number historically in that period of time. So again, it's not like livestock would have been the thing that you would really want to blame solely for this. Floodplain disturbances were certainly big on the Santa Cruz River because the citizens, starting with the people at Santa Vera del Bac, were making a lot of ditches to divert surface water for their use in fields and domestic uses. So could that have caused arroyo downcutting? It certainly caused it with respect to Sam Hughes's ditch downstream of St. Mary's Road, starting in 1890. But is that the only thing that happened? Paleo arroyos developed many times in the past, again, with no particular widespread development of ditches on the floodplain. There were canals and there were water harvesting structures built by the Hohokam Sobepari, but it wasn't that extensive. Abundant, and there were paleo arroyos at that time. So it doesn't guarantee channel erosion. Something else is going on besides that. The hypothesis that always got my attention was the groundwater table lowers during drought periods, which kills riparian vegetation. That decreases flow roughness, and we'll get to that concept in a big way in just a little while. But that means the same size flood is more erosive to the floodplain, and people have hypothesized that that's the reason why arroyos downcut. Well, that has huge holes in it. One of them on the Santa Cruz is that the data says that groundwater levels were high as of 1930. The dashed line up at the top, see if I can get that in there. This dashed line up here is where the channel bottom is. This is a time series. This dashed line is another thing. Hold on, go back. This lower dashed line is where the limit of which riparian roots can reach. So it was right around 1970 or so that we went past the tipping point of where riparian vegetation could actually exist because it could no longer reach guaranteed water. The peaks over on the lower right, one is the 1983 flood showing the recharge that occurred during that extraordinary event. And then there's a little peak associated with the 1993 flood as well. So groundwater lowering happened well after arroyos downcut. So, and as it turns out, most people who study groundwater, and I'm one of those people, know that groundwater just isn't that responsive to drought periods. It's more responsive to big recharge events like the 1983 flood. So climate variability comes in now. Arroyo downcutting is directly associated with a time of unusual floods, large size and persistent occurrence between 1880 and 1915. Arroyo widening also occurred during persistent flooding, but smaller in peak discharge between 1915 and 1929. And the arroyos were stable through the mid-century drought, but the channel narrowed during a period of lower floods. So there's a direct correlation here between floods and climate and channel erosion. So this was the ideas that I had come up with from my work 40 years ago, and it certainly fits perfectly on the Santa Cruz River. Here's the precipitation records going back to around 1869 or so for the University of Arizona. 1868 is what this says. I stopped at 2008. I haven't followed this since. But the important thing is the arroyo downcutting period happened during the late 19th century wet period, a period of a lot of summer and winter type rainfall periods. And then there was a little drought period. And then we had channel widening that occurred in the early 20th century during another wet period that a lot of summer rain and winter rain. Water for development is an important part of this story because as water is extracted from the alluvial aquifer, bad things happen to riparian vegetation. And it all centers first around the Mission Santa Vera del Bac, which was Bunny Fontana's topic of research for most of his life. At the mission, Santa Vera Mission, it's right down there near the bottom of that map, there were a lot of channels that were built. It was built around a permanent water supply from two different sources. One is a spring known as the Agua de la Misión that was upstream of Martinez Hill, and another one was off of Punta de Agua, which is on the west part of the Santa Cruz River. Those two channels, those two sources of water were what kept that mission going with its agriculture. So in 1890, there were roughly 10,000 people in the watershed. By 2012, there's 1 million people in that watershed. Well, guess what? We needed a lot more water. So we became dependent upon groundwater as well as blended Central Arizona project water. This is a very complicated graph that I made that shows the total water deliveries in big red. Up there, you can see it, how goes ups and downs, really takes off after about 1940, and especially in the mid-1950s during that drought period. Well, in around 1990, the CAP arrived in Tucson, and they started delivering CAP water directly to houses. It stank, and it had all kinds of cloudiness to it, and there was this unbelievable uproar. But the one thing it did was it really seriously cut down groundwater usage, as you can see from that little light blue line that's diving there just above the direct CAP line. Oops. Okay. Well, what they did was they decided to, instead of directly deliver CAP water to the city of Tucson residents, they would inject it via infiltration galleries out in the Avra Valley. And that became recovered CAP water. So as you can see on the graph of the little blue line, groundwater usage in the Tucson Basin went right back up, but then it started diving when recovered CAP water started getting delivered to the Tucson Basin. And now groundwater extraction from the Tucson Basin has gone way down. And actually, the aquifers under the city of Tucson are starting to recover from this. So this kind of shows what's happened in this town. This is Ray Turner's work. All of the repeat photography I'm going to show is from Ray Turner. This is looking east on Congress Street. The ridge over the Santa Cruz River is in the middle distance there. There's a line of trees over this around the Santa Cruz. Here it is again in the 1930s with a dirt road there on Congress Street. Here it is paved now in 1981 with Silver Lake Road coming in from the left at this point. And then finally, here we have it in 2007, seeing how the city of Tucson and the Tucson Basin, the growth has just gone astronomical. So in the 1930s, we had a number of things that went on. First off, it was a period where channels were narrowing. And as a result of that, we had all these wide channels from the 1915 flood. They decided to fill in those channels sides with landfills. So they had a couple of big ones that were put in just upstream of Congress Street. And the channel kept narrowing, but they wanted to push it even narrower in order to preserve Congress Street Bridge. So I'll show you that was a major problem in early Tucson history. So here's the Santa Cruz River again with one of those floods in the 1890s with those vertical arroyo banks. In the 1880s, the problem was that the Santa Cruz was damaging properties and flooding houses. Okay. Between 1890 and 1915, bridges started falling down and properties again were damaged. 1977 to 1983, the problem was destroyed bridges and damaged properties again, with also loss of life. So flood control, not riparian ecosystems, has been the priority on this river for 130 years. So this is, again, showing views of the Congress Street Bridge. There it is over on the left, looking at the western side of the Santa Catalina Mountains. This is a flood that was happening. Here's another flood in 1914. You can see the horse and buggies going over that bridge and the water up near the bridge deck. And now the bridge has fallen down and the channel has widened out considerably in the 1915 flood. Between 1916 and 1917, only small floods occurred, again, leading to channel narrowing. People forgot that this river could produce really large floods that would be damaging, and so they encroached upon the floodplain. In 1977, Hurricane Heather changed that with a destructive flood that occurred, and that made a big change in the way that Pima County thought about the Santa Cruz River. They installed soil cement. We'll show you that in just a second. They started in 1982 to help with the Congress Street Bridge and other bridges that were crossing the Santa Cruz to limit the lateral channel change, because that was what was the big concern. They didn't want those bridges falling down anymore. So flood control became a big deal between 1977 and 1993, and that was a good thing because there were some big floods. This is the 1983 flood near the peak of the flood. I believe this is off the St. Mary's Road Bridge. It's near the top of the banks here. And it had a discharge of 52,800 cubic feet per second, which was an extraordinary flood. Soil cement had been installed a year earlier, and it limited the damages that occurred, except for at the beginning and ends of the protected reaches. That observation prompted Pima County to install continuous soil cement in order to stop any kind of soil erosion happening during big floods. So that's why today, when you look at the Santa Cruz River, you see all that soil cement. Now, it's ugly, there's no doubt about it, but it's effective. And what they did was they put in sills across the channel to stop down cutting. And then they've got the arroyo banks, which is a trapezoidal channel, in order to stop lateral channel change. So it's a very effective flood control thing for stopping channel erosion. And this is one of the more telling graphs that I've ever made. So this is flood frequency on the Santa Cruz River. It's a time series, and it's color-coded for summer floods, fall floods, and winter floods. So if you look at the first period during the mid-century drought, where we had channel narrowing, those were mostly summer floods that occurred at that time. Monsoon storms, usually under 10,000 cubic feet per second. If you calculate the 100-year flood using this period of the record, it's 20,380 cubic feet per second. But during that period from 1977 to 1993, during a period of extraordinary wet and extraordinary floods, yeah, that 100-year flood goes to about 76,000 cubic feet per second. But then lately, back down again, 100-year floods about 20,170 cubic feet per second. So what happened was there was a reactionary process that went on where, because of the 83 and 93 floods and the high flood frequency that those portended, they created a design flood of about 65,000 cubic feet per second for the channel. So they wanted to make the channel so that they could contain that, especially downstream of Vina Road. And they had a regulatory flood, so-called, of 60,000 cubic feet per second, which is what they were using to, again, build bridges and things like that. But take a look at the flood frequency estimates here for 2010 and 2020. They're half that amount. As I said, because of climate and climate change, flood frequency declined considerably. So is the Santa Cruz River flood control measures, are they over-designed? Well, I'm going to go into this just briefly because this is a very high-level statistical concept that I don't want to just bore you with. But bottom line is that when you're calculating flood frequency, you're making some assumptions, which first off means that you have time invariant means and variances of the flood distribution. As you can see for the Santa Cruz River flood frequency, that isn't true for the whole length of the record. It is true for the sections that I worked on. So global climate change is now a classic example of non-stationarity because as things heat up, you no longer have a stable mean or a variance. So that the current situation with global warming is probably the best thing you could use to illustrate this concept of non-stationarity. So here's the Santa Cruz at Congress Street again, looking at a time series, 1914 with the bridge falling in, 1926, completely different bridge, they had to rebuild it. 1983, they had rebuilt that bridge again, and now they've got soil cement in there. And then in 2008, look at all that riparian vegetation that encroached on the channel. There's a lot of non-native stuff there. There's some Aethel tamarisk, for example, but there was a really big old black willow tree right next to the bridge. I know because I used to be on that bridge measuring. So there became a problem here. The problem, let's go back to climate first off. This is a time series that shows a couple of things that I would no longer use probably. It's not the Pacific Decadal Oscillation up at the top. But bottom line is that there were wet periods, there were drought periods, there were wet periods, and there were drought periods in the record. And those records really mirror what happened in terms of flood frequency on the Santa Cruz River. It mirrored it very well. So let's talk about ecosystems now, because this was really the heart of the book that we had and why we called it the Requiem for the Santa Cruz. So this is a photograph looking upstream at 22nd Street, showing the channel in about, was it 1902, I think, and then the channel in 2001. You can see that it had perennial flow. We knew that from the anecdotal records, but also it had mesquite forests there. But in 2001, that's all Aethel tamarisk or non-native plants along the river. This is the confluence. This is the Santa Cruz River where it meets a mountain just downstream from 22nd Street. That's a little mesquite bosque out there in the middle of the channel, and you can see it's a divided channel. There's also some cottonwood trees over there that are barren in this winter photo. Here we are in 1981. That's all Aethel tamarisk out there. There's non-native trees everywhere out there now and a lot of bare ground. This is a photo taken in 2000. Aethel tamarisk is mostly still there, but you can see the soil cement has been installed. So we wiped out some of these riparian ecosystems. Well, a lot of those little ones, like the one I just showed near 22nd Street, that's fine, but the big one was down to the south of Martinez Hill. Martinez Hill is at the lower part of this photograph, and there's a little marshy circle of things or oval of things down there that's really the subject of this discussion. We called it the Great Mesquite Forest, and it's between Martinez Hill and the new casino that's down there, the Tohono O'odham Casino. That area was a dense forest. The first observations that were made by the Mormon Battalion, who camped out there before 1850, said that it was an open cienega with alkali saccatone grasslands, and there was a rim of mesquite around it with trees of enormous size. They called them 44-foot in diameter and 65 to 75-foot tall mesquites. So there was a marsh with almost no trees in it, a big marsh, rimmed with mesquite, big mesquite. When the arroyo down cut, something happened that most people would not have expected. Most people who look at these things don't realize that this happened, but when it down cut, it drained the Cienega. It lowered the groundwater table to the bottom of the channel. And what that did was up on those banks above, mesquite could now grow. The alkali saccatone could not because it was now dry. But the mesquite wanted to deal with those unsaturated soils, and it grew very fast with an available water supply that was just guaranteed because it was high groundwater levels. So that attracted birds. And it was a world-class ecosystem. The top ornithologists in the US came to the Tucson Basin between 1900 and 1940 to look at birds in the Great Mesquite Forest. It was a really, really important place at that time. So again, it was between 1700 and 1850, it was a cienega rimmed with mesquite, and large trees were on the outer halo. There were cattle in that cienega in the 1860s, but nothing happened. Between the 1880s and 1890s, the arroyo downcut, lowering the water table to the bottom of the channel. The mesquite started encroaching on that now drained land. Between the 1880s and 1920s, intensive wood cutting occurred there because mesquite grows very fast when it's watered, and it supplied Tucson with fuel wood. And then the cut trees, they started growing secondary growth, and they just kept growing. So between about 1900 and 1940, the Great Mesquite Forest may have been at its zenith, despite all that wood cutting, despite channel down cutting, despite floods. So it was just showing that these ecosystems, you want to talk about the American rivers resilient, that was resilient as long as the groundwater was high. So again, this is kind of a cartoon that shows that. You have a high groundwater table before 1878 with emergent aquatic species. Cottonwoods are on the banks. You have mesquite on the terraces as well. You cut that arroyo down at the bottom. You grow a lot of mesquite on those floodplains. It's very dense mesquite because it's got all the water it could possibly need, and the groundwater lowers to the channel bottom. This is some photos that, again, Ray Turner took, 1912. This is off of Martinez Hill looking towards the Santa Rita Mountains. First off, I'd point out that's open water back there behind the what's known as the Indian Dam at that time. That dam was designed to divert that water to the Santa Rita del Bac. Those are arroyo walls showing that the arroyo had downcut by that time. And we had all these riparian plants that were growing as a result. And then there was agricultural clearing over there at that time as well. So we had a lot of things operating in 1912 that were going on in this thriving ecosystem. In 1936, we have our first aerial photograph of the Great Mesquite Forest. The forest, I digitized this, and it occupied an area of about 7 square miles. If you can look up there at the upper left, you can see agricultural development associated with the Santa Vera district and the Mission Santa Vera del Bac. But most of that Great Mesquite Forest extended downstream towards Pima Mine Road. Here, there was a lot of work done on the ecosystem. They documented 5 fish species, 2 frogs, 1 turtle, several endangered snakes, and a clam in here in these perennial reaches. The mammals were less certain, but we know that there was a mesquite mouse, another endangered species, gray wolf, another endangered species, and there probably were jaguars in there. There could have even been grizzly bears coming down from the Santa Ritas into this area as well. It was a hell of an ecosystem. It was famous among ornithologists. Again, they flocked here because there was more than 100 species of neotropical migrant birds, water birds, and resident birds. Many of these birds no longer occur in the United States, or they're threatened or endangered species. So it was a big deal, and there was a lot of things written about the Great Mesquite Forest by ornithologists. This is just a murderer's row of some of the birds that were in there that you're no longer going to see in the Tucson Basin, or if you do see them, it's going to be very lucky for you. I know the gray hawk sightings have been occurring lately, and I understood that there was a rose-throated Becard sighting as well not too long ago. But one of the things that is more important, I think, than these really rare species was the white-winged dove. The white-winged dove was the most common species in the Great Mesquite Forest. In 1922, A.C. Bent wrote that the white-winged doves fairly swarmed through the thickets, and their tiresome notes were the dominant sounds. Now, Arizona Game and Fish maintains a tamarisk reserve, a non-native species reserve on the Gila River for this species. That's what we lost. So here, I've got a quote from C.K. Smith, who testified before the U.S. Senate in 1931. He's the mayor of Tucson. The city of Tucson has been scouting for some time to get a larger and more available water supply for the city. Blah, blah, blah. Here's the important part. Our engineers have investigated the claim that there is more water than the Indians can ever use and more than Tucson can use for 50 years to come. So there it is. That's the first quote that I've ever found of the 50-year water supply or the 100-year water supply. It keeps occurring over and over and over again, and it's just not true. So what happened here was the bosque withstood the arroyo down cutting, the clearing for agriculture, and the wood cutting, but it could not withstand those stresses combined with the lowering of the groundwater table. So again, here's this graph that I showed before, the channel bottom and the limit of the riparian roots. So the possible zenith was around 1940 with really high groundwater levels and limited other uses in the area. Tipping points about 1970. Roy Johnson, as it turns out, was working out there on the Great Mesquite Forest around 1970. So he saw it firsthand. And then we had the other one that I'd explained before. Again, here's what happened. You had a high groundwater table. You had mesquite and cottonwoods right next to the channel. You lower the groundwater table 50 feet, the mesquite are dying. And when I first went out there in the 1980s, all I saw were these gigantic mesquite stumps out in this area where once there was this great mesquite forest because the groundwater had been lowered more than 90 feet. So here's the whodunit. Who killed it? Was it this guy, Mullen E. Lane, who invented the vertical turbine pump in 1902, allowing aquifers to be pumped from below instead of from the surface? You might not have ever thought about this, but if you suck on a straw, if you had such strong lungs, you can only suck from a maximum of 32 feet. After that, there's cavitation that occurs, so you can no longer get water below 32 feet. But if you put a pump at the bottom of a well, doesn't matter how deep it is, 1,000 feet, you can push it straight up. You can go as deep as you want. So that's what happened. In 1902, that was invented, and then by the 1920s, it's on the Santa Cruz River. The other whodunit, was it Mayor C.K. Smith, who wanted to take all that water for Tucson without regard for other possibilities of the ecosystem? Well, could have been. Or was it all of our predecessors, the citizenry of Tucson and Pima County, who wanted more and more water without understanding the consequences to this priceless ecosystem that they killed? You pick it. But here it is. This is 1912. There's 1981, again, Ray Turner work. There's 2002. You can see that it's just gone. Here it is in 1942, right near its zenith. Those are cottonwood trees in the foreground because they're right along the channel. And there it is again, taken out in 1989. So when I became aware of all this, and I was the guy that became aware of all this, I started thinking, let's find equivalent bosques, because I wanted to know what the biggest environmental disaster was on an American river related to this. And I started looking around and realized that there's the Bosque del Apache in the Rio Grande River in New Mexico, that was taken out by a lot of things, including dam construction. The Comatqui thicket on the Santa Cruz River at the Gila River confluence, no one really knows what went on there, but it was obviously a mesquite bosque that was taken out by groundwater pumping as well. But again, the history is not very well known. The Gila River at the San Carlos River confluence was a big mesquite bosque, but now it's underneath San Carlos Reservoir, so completely wiped out there. And then the Gila River at the Colorado River confluence, which is now a tamarisk thicket because of flood control and all the uses of the Colorado River. And then there's the Colorado River Delta. So this is the data on the Delta that I developed. This is all in Mexico. And these are the areas before and after. Cottonwood and willow, there were roughly 1,400 hectares. And surprisingly, there's still 1,120 hectares there. And there's good reason for that I won't go into here. But the big deal is the heavy mesquite timber, 10,500 hectares to zero. The Santa Cruz River, 2,071 hectares of heavy mesquite timber. And like the Colorado River Delta, 0 hectares now. But the Santa Cruz River is in the United States, not in Mexico. So I think I would offer up that the Great Mesquite Forest was one of the biggest environmental disasters that's ever happened along a river in the United States. So we get to this issue raised by American rivers. Restoration, what the heck is that? I think it's a euphemism for creation of designer ecosystems with little or no relation to what the resources were. It typically is vaguely defined, and it's definitely advocacy. It's not science. But so when you hear that word restoration, you want to immediately ask, restore to what and when? I didn't see American rivers asking that one at all. So here's another part of this story that is really important that we need to talk about, which is channel filling. In 1982, the channel was relatively narrow at Congress Street, and they widened it out with trapezoidal channels shown in dark in the heavy black there at the bottom. This is a cross-section of the river, by the way. Almost immediately, it started sedimenting in over on that left side. And you can see the red 1989 survey that I conducted, 2005 airborne LIDAR, and 2008 LIDAR that I ran. You can see the sediment occurring in there, again, with the channel trying to narrow. And this is all after the 1983 flood. So here's a picture of the Santa Cruz upstream of Congress Street. You can see that riparian vegetation and that channel sedimentation over there on the left side, with the soil cement very prominent over here on the right side, okay? It was filling up. So you need to get a couple of concepts here from surface water hydrologic modeling, which is what I used to do. Flow conveyance is the words that are used to talk about the amount of discharge that a channel can contain. Roughness is the resistance to flow, and the higher the roughness, the lower the channel conveyance. So increasing riparian vegetation increases the roughness and decreases the conveyance. This is kind of a complicated graph that illustrates it. Blue line is the stage discharge relation for the Santa Cruz River at Congress Street in 1992. And then the red line is the stage discharge relation, same place, 2008. You can see those are very different graphs. And here's what happens. In 1992, a stage of roughly 10 feet, in other words, roughly 10 feet of water in the channel, 10 feet deep, will have a discharge of about roughly 24,000 cubic feet per second. Well, the same stage in 2008 can only take 10,000 cubic feet per second, or less than half. So here's another way to think about it. A discharge of roughly 15,000 cubic feet per second in 1992 would have a stage of roughly 8.5 feet. But the same discharge in 2008 would have a stage of 12 feet. This is why in around 2008, I woke up on my way work with an NPR broadcast that talked about the biggest flood in the Santa Cruz River since 1983. And when I looked at the records, we had 10,000 cubic feet per second out there, and yet it was not so far below the bridges in the river. It was because of decreased flow conveyance as a result of that aggradation and the riparian vegetation that was growing. Something had to happen here. So in 1982, when the soil cement was put in, it looked like a trapezoidal channel. In 2012, this is what it looked like with a decreased channel width, which was barren, and then all kinds of riparian vegetation on the banks. The channel was engineered to convey 60,000 cubic feet per second for the 100-year flood in that period after the 1983 flood. Channel aggradation post-1993 encouraged growth of riparian vegetation, increasing the channel width, roughness. The channel in 2012 could convey about 30,000, or roughly half of that design flood, which is the drought-induced 100-year flood of all things. So the irony of it all is that climate has been controlling this whole thing, and we're just lucky that we were able to only have a 30,000 cubic feet per second, 100-year flood as a result of climate change. But the memory of that 83 flood at 52,800 cubic feet per second, yeah, that meant that we had to have, for public safety, we had to dredge. And that's exactly what Pima County did. Here's Congress Street, again, showing that levee. I mean, the aggradation and riparian vegetation just upstream from the bridge. And then there it is at the bottom in 2020, having been dredged. You can now see the soil cement over there on the upstream of the bridge. It reverted it to a trapezoidal cross section, but lo and behold, they may have dredged it, but that riparian vegetation started growing back almost immediately. And again, you had a very low roughness in that channel before because it was sandy. After only 1 year of flow, you had all this roughness increase. So you have a dredging solution to this possible overbank flooding threat that went on, but it isn't permanent. So this is looking at the 22nd Street area, just downstream of 22nd Street, a bend there. You can see it at the top where it's a barren channel with mostly aethel tamarisk out there, a few mesquite probably. But in 2020, they had decided to drop reclaimed water into the channel just upstream of 22nd Street Bridge. And they also introduced longfin dace to this channel. It was an endangered species that had been obviously wiped out. Well, I mean, was it there before? Could have been, who knows? But just you'd add water and all kinds of interesting things happen. One of the things that was of concern and what stopped that water addition for a while were those landfills that were put in the 1930s to 1940s. They were seriously concerned that even though the soil cement protected those landfills from being eroded by lateral movement of the channel, that maybe the water going in would get to the landfills and thereby cause pollution. Well, again, you're ignoring how groundwater works. It basically flows by gravity, so it goes straight down. It doesn't go laterally over into that landfill, and generally flows downstream along the channel bed, along the aquitard, which is the confining layer of clay that's below the river. So that was probably less concerning. But here's what the bottom line is. This is the Santa Cruz River that downstream from Ina Road. And what you see in the river there is the discharges combined from the Roger Road and Ina Road sewage treatment plants. This is reclaimed water. And you've got a narrow strip of riparian vegetation out there. Some riparian ecologists say really poo-pooed all this, saying, oh, it's just a narrow strip of riparian, but it's riparian vegetation and it's growing there, okay? And it also supports the ecosystem of birds. Birders now come to this area to look for their favorite animals that they want to sight. So you just add water and you get riparian ecosystems. But this was the one that always attracted my attention. There was a big shopping mall that was put in between Irvington Road and Valencia on the east bank of the Santa Cruz River. And what they had them do was engineer the Santa Cruz River around that shopping mall in a very interesting way. First off, they put in very low soil cement to limit the amount of channel widening that could occur here. And then they've got these big setback levees to create this huge cross section for overbank inundation to stop that from ever happening. Here, you could grow all the riparian vegetation that you could possibly want. The problem is you'd have to water it because the groundwater levels are so low. But that's what could happen downtown. Higher setback levees are needed if reclaimed water discharges continue to sustain riparian vegetation in the soil cemented channel. Otherwise, the flood hazard increases with time. That's just the way that the Santa Cruz has been in its recorded history. I want to finish this talk by looking at something hopeful. This is the Santa Cruz River at the I-19 bridge, right at the foot of Martinez Hill. These are all from Google Earth, which I love Google Earth now because it enables you to do things that we could not do before. We had to really work at before. Because it's pretty much a barren channel there in 2007. And here you can see that the floodplains have started to get encroached upon with some vegetation. There actually is some cottonwood that's growing near the Interstate 19 freeway corridor. Here it is in 2018. Man, there's a lot going on there with riparian veg in the channel. And then there's even more of it, but big cottonwood trees growing up. And the channel widens occasionally with some floods, but then it goes right back down narrow. Here it is now in 2024, in January of this year. That's perennial flow in the channel there going underneath that Interstate 19 bridge and underneath the Santa Vir bridge. And it's lined with cottonwood and willow trees, what's known as dog-haired thickets. This water is becoming, ironically enough, it's coming from overwatering of those alfalfa fields that you see at the lower left. Okay, they're recharging using CAP water. They're recharging the aquifer and it's discharging in the Santa Cruz River and it's recreating the Great Mesquite Thicket. And are we going to have a return of this now or cottonwood willow forest, which is more likely what's going to happen? There could be cedar mesquite in there too. There's certainly the potential of it. But right now it's cottonwood willow, which, you know, according to every riparian ecologist up to about the mid 1990s, we lost it all. Well, not here because this is a photograph that's difficult to take. I'm actually looking at the northbound I-19 bridge, and underneath that, those are cottonwood and willow trees, and you can see how tall they are. They're about 6 to 10 feet tall now, and still growing as a result of that high groundwater level. So, going back to the original things, what do we want from these arid region rivers? Do we want a requiem? Do we want to just sing our song of death? Or do we think maybe there's a possibility of resurrection here? I'm going for this Great Mesquite Forest and being very hopeful about it because as long as they're dumping CAP water on those alfalfa fields, we're going to still have discharge into that river at that point, and we're going to be growing cottonwood and willow. So there's some hope here for some kind of a limited return to what was there and what was lost around the turn of the 20th century to 1940. So with that, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I know that we're almost out of time, so if folks have to go, I understand, but we do have a few questions, and this is recorded, so if folks need to go, you could always watch the recording that will be on our YouTube channel. So the first question is, what was the effect of the 1887 Sonoran earthquake on water supplies? For example, the Agua de Mission spring stopped flowing. Betancourt's dissertation said that the earthquake may have had an effect on water.
Oh, it most certainly did. Anytime you shake the ground that violently, you're going to change some things. And the spring source was altered for a period of time, but It came up in a different location, slightly different location. There were people at that time, Julio being one of them, that thought that the 1887 earthquake was part of the whole Arroyo downcutting problem, but that obviously is not the case because the Arroyo downcutting problem was all over the southwestern US, and that earthquake was not felt that far away. So it had a limited effect, yes, but a lasting effect, no.
Okay. And another question is, early on, you mentioned your cynicism regarding the term restoration. This person wants to know if you're not a believer in restoration ecology as a concept or just as an industry. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, the problem with restoration more than anything else is its advocacy. It would be nice to actually have science-based restoration that actually realized what was in a particular place at a particular time, and you set your goals back to a certain period of time. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of people with preconceived ideas that want to turn a place into something that it never was. And it happens quite often. And it's not science, it's advocacy. Now, I want to say that there's nothing wrong with that, except when it's claimed to be backed by science, because it isn't. It's just somebody wanting to create like a park or something, you know, a river park. You can always water riparian vegetation, right? But how are you going to restore that groundwater level that was taken away from us? How are you going to do that? You're not going to. So all you can do with the Santa Cruz right now is play some games with reclaimed water, or you've got an absolutely incredible thing going on just upstream of Martinez Hill, where just by happenstance, you have water coming off of an alfalfa field. Nobody's doing that. There's nobody planting anything there. It's just happening. And that's what I love about it, is there's nobody involved that's trying to claim that this was here before and that was there then, and we need to do something. When people on the Santa Cruz, around the time that they started dumping the reclaimed water in, there was all these claims of restoration there. Well, you know, I'm sorry, but where you're restoring to? There were 2 lakes in that region. Are you restoring to those 2 lakes? Are you going to actually fill in the arroyo? Are you going to increase the groundwater level regionally? Those were never discussed. I like the restoration industry because their hearts are in the right places, but I don't like it painted as science, because it isn't.
That's a really important distinction. And so maybe just as a final question, what can folks do to help the Santa Cruz or the other endangered rivers in Arizona? What can the average person do? Do you have organizations that you recommend that folks maybe volunteer with, or any kind of action that people can take to help if they're passionate about this?
Yeah, try using less water. Try playing less golf. You know, try not having a swimming pool. Try all of those things that have increased the water demand historically in our basin, because that's what we need to do, is to no longer have lawns. If you have lawns, sure, reclaimed waters are fine, in that, but you're not going to fill swimming pools with reclaimed water, right? So I think just use less water. That's what the best thing that any individual can do. There's all kinds of groups that are out picking up trash in the Santa Cruz. That's fine too. I like that. There's people that are advocating planting trees all over the place. I like that too. But for everybody, yeah, use less water.
Okay. Okay. Well, on that note, thank you so much for your time. And this was a super interesting presentation. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Okay. So on the screen, there's a link to a brief survey, which will also be emailed to you. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. The recording of this presentation will be made available on our YouTube channel, so be sure to to share the link with friends who may have missed today's presentation. We hope to see you at future events and in our reading. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.